So welcome to follow an interview with Honorary Doctor. My name is Oinas-Kukkonen, and our guest today will be Honorary Dr. Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman is an American internet entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and author. Reid co-founded LinkedIn, and he is currently a partner at Greylock, one of the leading venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. He is the co-author of 3 best-selling books: Startup of You, The Alliance, and Blitzscaling. He's also the host of the podcast Masters of Scale. Reid has influenced research and teaching of emerging information technologies, globalization, and entrepreneurship in the University of Oulu. In this interview, we will get to know more closely the life and career of entrepreneur investor Reid Hoffman, who will be conferred as Honorary Doctor in the 11th conferment ceremony of University of Oulu. Welcome, Reid Hoffman.
It's a pleasure and honor to be here.
So you grew up in Berkeley, California. How was your childhood like?
Well, I think my childhood was probably like many people's childhoods. A little bit of curiosity, a little bit of confusion. I think maybe perhaps one of the things that's not totally unique, but somewhat different than some people's childhoods is I was a huge fan of science fiction. So I would read a ton of science fiction, and that gave me a little bit of a question about the stage that I would play on being the stage of humanity. Who are we and who should we be? And how does technology play into that? And what should you be doing? And reading those early science fiction books, I think, made that my palette. But other than that, I was a kid. I played games. I had a paper route. I sometimes did well at school, sometimes not so well at school. It was kind of a classic American West Coast childhood.
So then you did a bachelor's degree in the symbolic systems program at Stanford University. And after that continued studies in the University of Oxford, where you did masters in philosophy. What do these studies, or what did they mean for you?
So when I first got to university, I was kind of still in this question of like, what is the human quest? What is meaning of life? What is, who are we with each other? And what I realized is one of the central things about human beings, obviously, is we are kind of creatures that think, that reason, that communicate, that speak, in addition, of course, to play and create and make art and all the rest. And what I wanted to do was understand that kind of thought and language. I wanted to understand how we communicated, how we understood each other, how we reasoned to kind of better truths about ourselves and about the world and who we should become. And so my undergraduate was a degree called Symbolic Systems, which is rather like artificial intelligence and cognitive science. And in doing that, I realized that we didn't really have a good model for what thinking and language was. We do it. We understand it, just like many other things in our lives, but we can't describe it. We can't say why it works. Like, how is it that we exactly understand each other? When do we really misunderstand each other? How does language actually, in fact, really work? I mean, philosophers, throughout the ages, including Kant and Wittgenstein, are still all, we're really working very hard at this and didn't know. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe philosophy could help with that. And so that's part of the reason why I applied for a Marshall Scholarship and went to Oxford and studied philosophy, was an attempt to understand that. And what I learned was there was a lot of great philosophical tools, but we still don't really understand what thinking and speaking is, even though we do it.
So did you ever consider a career in academia?
I did. Originally, I was thinking I would be, because of that interest in understanding the kind of this thinking and language of humanity. And it was one of the things that, I always enjoy participating with academic institutions and professors, because that notion of applying thinking to making our lives better, to understanding better, is one of the things that is very deep to me. But the other thing that I had discovered was that I also back to that kind of science fiction childhood, that kind of I want to play at scale, of humanity. What I realized was, is like, well, okay, the academic career, at least in the path that I was seeing, kind of looked like, study intensely one, very focused area of scholarship. And what I wanted to do was say, well, how does society evolve? How do you make interventions that help us be better as individuals and as society? And because I'd gone to Stanford as an undergraduate, I actually then realized, actually, in fact, there's this notion of entrepreneurship, of creating new products, and that those new products themselves may be something that has kind of a society-wide, a global-wide scope. And maybe that was a interesting place to apply the kind of the learnings and the thinkings that I was getting from academia.
So then you co-founded your first company in 1997. So that was based on social networks, and that happened already way before social networks became big. So how did that happen? How did you recognize, how did you see this emerging new opportunity so early on?
So I didn't necessarily know that there was going to be a whole trend across the internet. What I did know was that the thing that frequently when a lot of software design and thinking about design in the future is taught, it's taught in this context of people, places, and things. And what I had kind of really focused on was that when you think about, kind of like the Aristotle conception of people, that, we're creatures of the polis, right? It's frequently in English slightly misconceived as political animals. It's really kind of more social animals, city animals, tribal animals. And so people, rather than people, places, and things is a thing. And so I knew that that was the area that I wanted to try to help create something that would be useful. So it wasn't so much as thinking, okay, there's going to be all of Web 2.0 is going to be the social network overlay on the internet, as much as this is one of the really fundamental things to helping people find their better selves, helping societies evolve. And it's this pattern of changing social space through the internet space, through the electronic space. And that was the thing that I knew from when I applied to my first job at Apple, was the thing that I wanted to be working on. Now, once you start thinking that way, it naturally plays out that you start thinking social net and social networking, and you start thinking about things like identity and communications, and you start thinking about networks as platforms, all of the things that lead to social networking, so I had kind of started on that path earlier than many internet entrepreneurs and many of the zeitgeist of the memes of the technology creation. But it wasn't so much as predicting the zeitgeist as thinking about, how do we make ourselves better as individuals and as groups in terms of, and then use internet technologies as a way to do that.
So PayPal then is a very well-known and widely used electronic service for money transfer. And you were in the board of directors when the company was founded, and you also served the company as chief operating officer and executive vice president. So now that you look back and think about PayPal, what do you consider to be the biggest achievement, your achievement with PayPal?
I think it's funny when you have things that are as intense as startups. It's frequently hard to pick the best or the biggest achievement, because in startups it's frequently between the company failed and died, and then it succeeded and created something that was new for the world and society or important. And so my my part of the executive team in building this thing that kind of created a new network of payments, allowed individuals and small businesses to participate in electronic payments, and accelerated kind of commerce globally, was obviously something that was a great team. I'd say for me personally, a lot of the problems that were handed to me were, when you're establishing a new platform, you have a lot of call it kind of competitive rejection. It can be competitive rejection from Visa and MasterCard. It can be competitive rejection from eBay. It can be competitive rejection from the banking system and government regulation. And most often, I was the person tasked with navigating that. Matter of fact, in all of those cases, I was the person tasked with navigating that. And so you say, all right, how do we get through that kind of network or competitive rejection? We get allowed to exist, in the society, and then improve society from that. I'd say that was probably the set of activities, because without that, probably PayPal would have never succeeded. And so that's probably the part that personally I was most responsible for.
And after PayPal, you shifted into business or organization-oriented online social networks. You ended up co-founding LinkedIn, so well-known company and service being used globally everywhere. So you have served in various leading positions in LinkedIn, most recently chairman of the board. Now, if we travel back in history, how did you come up with the idea of LinkedIn?
Well, it actually came back from the SocialNet idea time, not surprisingly. So SocialNet, the idea was focused on how do you build various relationships that matter to people, like a topology. So there's obviously dating relationships, but then there's also like sports and activities, finding people to play tennis or football with. Then there was roommates, and one of them was professional colleagues. We called it at Social Network Working Network. And when I was looking back at what are the things that I thought where there was the biggest gap, the least understanding and the most need for it, I realized that the professional relationships and the thinking about that was one of the more important things, because it affected people's work careers. It affected their abilities to be competent and effective as professionals. It affected their ability to learn, to be able to do entrepreneurship, make work happen. And so when we sold PayPal to eBay, I then said, okay, well, what is the place where there's still a massive need for a network that would transform, kind of our lives? And I was like, well, actually, in fact, in this area of work, in this area of career, and in part, one of the things that was really key, and this is something that I do a lot in investing and a lot of entrepreneurship, is where are you contrarian but right? And so like most people thought, well, I don't even think there's a category here. Like when we started it, there was a site called Friendster. It's like Facebook. And people said, oh, LinkedIn is like Friendster, but for business, which is kind of basically incomprehensible. It's kind of because it's a different thing. It's like you say, maybe something like, well, Microsoft is YouTube, but for productivity. And you're like, well, wait, it's not, it's different. It's a different area, right? In terms of how to do that. And so that was the reason I focused on it, because I think if we establish this, it could make a huge difference in a compounding way in people's lives year after year. And that would be the kind of thing that would be a good thing to be added into the set of ways that we navigate life, that we communicate and collaborate with each other, that we think about, like, well, what is the meaning of my life and what am I doing? Well, it's because I have this really great work that I can be very effective at over my career.
So LinkedIn is strongly based on social network analysis, which is a research area of its own. There is a long research tradition, 40, 50 years of scientific academic research on it. When you originally developed the product, did you look into this 40, 50 years of research into network analysis? And in more general, what do you think? Do the tech companies really listen to scientists, the academia, and draw lessons from there?
So I certainly did some, partially my own academic background, and also the interest in trying to figure out, like, okay, I have this theory about how we live in networks and how interventions by creating certain kinds of internet software products can improve both us individually and collectively, and how that applies to how we work and have careers, and then obviously other things as well. And so I did. I didn't. One of the classic things in entrepreneurship, I didn't have time to be thorough. Like I didn't have time to do the equivalent of writing a PhD or even a new scholarly paper. But I would grab some books and some papers and I would skim through them, looking for ideas and lenses that would affect how I would think about what the network ecosystem should look like and what are kind of attributes to that. So I did some. And I think that the general answer in entrepreneurship is somewhat parallel, which is there are some entrepreneurs who don't do it all. They don't have the academic background. They're just trying to make stuff happen. And by the way, there's a predisposition in entrepreneurship to be successful is you have to just act and kind of move into it, because the metaphor I use for entrepreneurship is you jump off a cliff and you assemble an airplane on the way down. You don't have lots of time for reflection. You don't have time. You have to get the plane going. On the other hand, of course, there are both people who go into academia in entrepreneurship with PhDs, and so have more, kind of awareness of some of the depth of knowledge and ideas and so forth within academia. And of course, when you're building technologies, there's a lot of interesting technological work and so forth that also frequently gets reflected into entrepreneurial efforts. So the answer is some, probably, as always, should be somewhat more, but also needs to the difference in academia and entrepreneurship is in academia you say, well, I really need to get to a new idea that's very coherently thought through with a lot of questions and researched within a band of scholarship. In an entrepreneurship is I need to build a product that customers are buying and it's scaling, and I need to get to that as soon as possible.
So if we now would still speak a little bit about the early days of LinkedIn. Now, at that time, you already were a successful entrepreneur. You had a tremendous experience and skill set there. Was it easy? Was it a piece of cake for you to create LinkedIn?
Well, one of the pieces of advice I give entrepreneurs is that almost every startup goes through what I call a valley of the shadow moment, which is like, why did you ever think this was a good idea? It looked like it's all going to fail. When I started my first company, SocialNet, a friend of mine who had started being an entrepreneur a few years earlier wrote me a one-line email saying, welcome to where 5 minutes is the difference between exultation and terror. Exultation, oh, it's all going to work. Terror, it's going to die. And so it's always a challenging thing, even with experience, even with a strong network, even with a knowledge of it, because it's when you're trying to create something new, something that doesn't exist yet. There's all kinds of different ways it can fail. And some of them have nothing to do with your skills or capabilities. They're the luck and the timeliness of the market, the shape of competition, the question of did you pull the when you're looking through the glass darkly about what are the right product plans or the right go-to-market strategy, did you get the right elements right in the right order? There's all of the stuff that you do as best you can, but you're another metaphor I use for entrepreneurship is you're running through a minefield in the fog at night. You're like, where did you step? Did it work? Did it not work? And so therefore agility is very important. So it was difficult. Now it was less difficult because there were a bunch of things you knew. You knew how to hire that initial team. You knew what benchmarks should look like. You knew things like actually get to your minimum viable product within consumer internet. You had a network to hire from. Capital was easier to come by because you were a known, founder and executive for doing it. So the answer was it was easier, but it is still always jumping off that cliff.
Sounds like tough job to do, always. Now, coming to funding and investing, you already mentioned. Now, you are currently also a partner at Greylock Partners, one of the leading venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. So now, how do you make it happen? How does Greylock recognize the companies you want to invest in? And when there is so many different options, there's so many startups who are eager to grow and tell their stories, how do you recognize where to invest in?
One of the things that I love about the investing skill practice decisioning is it's a combination of art and science. And what I mean by that is that there's a deep professional practice around science. So, for example, you can get a sense of what kinds of markets are good, what kind of pattern you need to have in your customer set, what kinds of technological efforts are generally achievable, what kinds of mindsets in entrepreneurs lead to the learning and the iteration of success. How do you create good, healthy company cultures initially? What are the kinds of leadership to do that? And that all kind of gets into there's a set of things that you learn, as operators, as founders, but also as investors to do that. And on the other hand, part of what you're doing is you're looking at something new. And there's maybe a little story on this, which is a kind of a fun encapsulation, which is I joined Greylock because of David Z, who was my most useful board member at LinkedIn. He provided a great foil and partnership to the things I was doing as a partner at Greylock. And so when he came to say, hey, maybe you should think about venture, I went and joined him. My very first investment at Greylock was Airbnb. And David, when we were talking about it, because you have a set of partners around the table, we were talking about what could possibly happen, what are the risks, is this a good, a bold bet for the portfolio, et cetera. David, who was super smart, one of the world-class investors, literally should be in the venture capital hall of fame, looked at me and said, look, Airbnb is never going to work, but every VC has to have a company that they're going to learn on. So Airbnb can be your learning example of what fails. So, you're fine doing it, but it's not going to work. And here is a super smart, very accomplished investor who I joined Greylock because I wanted to be, kind of close partners with David. And so I, obviously took that very seriously and thought very hard about it, and then decided to make the investment. And then 6 months later, the data hadn't changed, but David had been thinking about it, and he came to me and said, "This is part of that learning curve in venture that's very important, and that's what we practice as a partnership at Greylock." And I think it's one of the things that's important as entrepreneurs and important as investors to say, always be learning, always be learning, always be like, okay, how do I decision better? How do I think better about these things? And he said, okay, you were totally right about Airbnb and I was wrong. What did you see that I didn't see? And I said, well, you were absolutely right about all the risks that you brought out. You brought out the risks of, maybe cities wouldn't like this. You brought out the regulation question. You brought about the industry opposition by hotels. You brought up about the social strangeness about leasing a room or your apartment to someone you didn't know. Like all of these things were correct and could have, provide limitations. But what I concluded is that they weren't certainly correct. They were possibly correct, that there were things you could do to possibly navigate them. And if you did navigate them as a company, you would create an internet treasure. You would create something that would be so important to lots and lots of people about how they navigated and experienced life, in particular travel and connecting with local communities, that it would just be huge. And so part of our job as venture capitalists is figuring out that thing that's contrarian but right and adds in something fundamentally new to human life at a kind of a society and a global level. And that's why, I made the investment. Okay, great. That's a good lens. We'll now add that one into the discussion that when we talk about new investments.
Excellent. So also over the years, in addition to business entrepreneurship, you have gained extensive experience in positions of trust. For example, giving advice to President Obama's administration. So what inspires and motivates you to put your time also into so-called additional tasks and services, doing extra?
So, well, it really comes down to is who are we? Who are you? What's your participation in life and with other people? And obviously, creating these new products is one of the things I hope to help us be better as individuals in society. But also, of course, we live in a society. We live in this kind of this social fabric, this community together. And so you should always think, like, how do I take what I know and I'm helpful to who we're becoming? And so not only, of course, do I, and I treasure President Obama as a friend and was delighted to help him, but also any qualified, serious intent, good world leader, I always meet with them when I can. I've met with President Macron. I've met with kind of David Cameron. I've met with various ministers from Singapore and France and Germany, and so because when they reach out and they say, hey, we're trying to figure out this, like entrepreneurship or technology or the internet or encryption or something, and we need to figure out how to make this the right shape for being good for society. That's part of, when you have the ability to help, that's part of your responsibility. And so I do that, I think of that globally, right? It's not just a question of the US, but anywhere where people are serious about, like, how do we help people be better humans, compassionate, wise, kind of collaborative together, and in which case, help as best you can.
So you have huge achievements in your career. What are you most proud of?
Well, I guess, it's funny. These kinds of questions of the best, the most, I'm always a little bit bad at, because it tends to be contextual. So, for example, you said as an entrepreneur, obviously, I think it's LinkedIn and the creation of LinkedIn. I think, as an investor, it's kind of recognizing these new network things, Airbnb and Facebook and so forth, as ways of putting them together. As a board member, it's being a good collaborator and help, and knowing that this is their journey, but I am a helper, right? Like I am actually, in fact, someone frequently I've been called Yoda, right, as a metaphor. But one of the ones that was more fun recently is someone called me Gandalf, right? So it's kind of here's what you should think about doing, and maybe this is the way that you should consider these risks and try this play, and so all of that is stuff that I'm proud in. But I also, of course, I think part of the thing that's very important for everyone is, like, how are you with the people you work with? Would people you work with say, I would like to work with you for the rest of my life, and that we collaborate well together? And I think that, like, the whole kind of tapestry of these kinds of things that I think I am happy about and always trying to be better at.
So is there still something you would want to pursue in your career? Something...
I've been very lucky and very fortunate, and so it may be a little bit overly ambitious to hope that still the best is yet to come. That there are still things that I can do, and when there's a whole palette of problems I think about. I think about how do we use the internet to get more to truth and closer to truth. Obviously, we see elements of that working in LinkedIn versus other kinds of social networks. I think about how do we build and define new kinds of networks that really make a big difference? I mean, like, one of the things I think is very important right now that too often the world loses track of is that any problem that you want to solve at scale, it can be economic justice in society, it can be medicine, it can be education, all of which you should have a technological solution to. Technology is one of the major parts of that scale. So how do I help society realize that technological orientation and then be techno-futurists? Like, how do we make it? Doesn't mean that all technology is unabridgedly good, but we can shape it. We can make it to what we would like to be good. And how do we take that as a mindset and as approach versus the sometimes fearful response of ooh, that's changing things and I'm fearful of it. And you're like, no, change is part of humanity. How do we change to better?
Exciting. And well, now that you are going to be an honorary doctor in Oulu, how was your connection to Oulu, University of Oulu, formed?
Well, I think you were my first connection to Oulu, which is, kind of as a smart academic that thought it's not just about thinking and research, but actually connecting with people who are doing, who are being practitioners on the ground, and how do you bring that theory and practice together? And then that made me see Oulu and what you guys are doing. But that combination of academia and scholarship and thoughtfulness together with, like, okay, What matters is that that kind of the rubber, the changes in the world. And I first started tracking it, I think, through some of our earliest conversations.
And you have been speaking about humanized technologies. What do you mean with those?
Part of what you think about is, how do we become better as human beings? And how do we have better individual and better societies? And so, for example, people worry about, like, well, a robot's going to replace human jobs and that's going to make a change. And then the question is, so, well, actually, in fact, that's frequently what has happened with productivity in human society. It's like, well, the move from agriculture to manufacturing was a lot of machinery that made agriculture much more efficient. And so you could take 90% of the human population off that and move them to other tasks, even over 90%. And then, I think similarly, that sort of path. But then I think what you need to do is say, well, how do we create paths of creativity, of work, of social participation, that as the landscape of work changes, that we still have that kind of healthy society participation. You can call it work or not call it work. And I think it's participation within the structure and the activity of society by which you're rewarded from participating in the group. And I think that's the kind of thing to think about technology. It doesn't mean don't create autonomous vehicles. I actually think autonomous vehicles are going to be a super important part of unlocking future prosperity and helping climate change within cities and redesigning space within cities and everything else. But it's like, okay, how do we then say, well, a bunch of work's going to change? How do we help that change to being, kind of human beings with dignity? And that's what I mean by kind of human-oriented technology.
And along the same lines, this is a big question. You've been already touching it from different angles. But how would you distill? How do innovations happen?
Well, I think the way that innovations happen is always evolving and changing. There isn't one set formula. There isn't one, like, take these three ingredients, mix them together, presto changeo, innovation. But I think there are some patterns. So the patterns are trying to be synthetic between different areas of understanding and like, for example, disciplines in academia, or thinking about what technological changes open up, right? So you say, well, now we actually have this play where we can communicate with everybody in real time. What kinds of new patterns about how we can interact become that? Now we have a 24/7 always communicating. Well, how do our identities lead into that? We have the internet. How does that redo how we work? We have massive increases in data. Well, that means we can create AI, and means we can create robotics, and we can create personalized medicine. And so you begin thinking about, like, what are these things that lead to new changes, that as part of that new change can create something that's magical. And that's those questions, that curiosity, that bringing in elements from different areas and thinking about where the trajectory is going is, I think, part of, are the elements that help innovation come together, even though it's still always something about serendipity, mystery, curiosity is always there.
Thanks. It has been excellent to hear about your life and career. Two final questions. How does it feel like to be conferred as honorary doctor? What does this recognition mean for you?
Well, I'm hugely honored and I'm very grateful. I've always thought, because from my various earliest days, that the participation in the academy and bringing the academy between the academy and the real world is one of the important places things happen. It's almost like the innovation question about, like, ideas applied to what we build, what we do. And so the participation within the academy and the landscape of ideas and learning and teaching and researching and discovering is something that is something I value deeply. And so I'm humbled and honored.
And finally, If you would be asked to describe University of Oulu with 3 words, 3 concepts, what would those words be?
Always a challenge. Wow, getting down to 3 words. It's much easier to say it longer. Inventive, thoughtful, looking for the right word. Synthetic is not human enough. It's integrative.
Thank you. It has been wonderful. Hopefully we will see soon you in Oulu. And thank you so much for this interview.
Pleasure and an honor. And yes, I look forward to visiting once we've cleared the pandemic into our history books.